I'm going to start with a quote from the book of Lismore in honour of St. Bridget, who we know is the patroness of the conference. Wherefore then it came to pass that the comradeship of the world's sons of reading is with Bridget, and the Lord gives them, through Bridget's prayer, every perfect good they ask. So I titled this talk Reclaiming Femininity because in the week of agreeing somewhat, maybe very reluctantly I'm afraid, to stand up here, I was clear on one thing only, and that's that I wanted everyone here to take away something positive from this conference. I think that I got the nap session after lunch, so I hope particularly the men will be able to stay awake, because sometimes when they hear the talks about women, they decide it's time to take a nap. I'm not going to let you away with that. So I think the first thing I'm going to talk about is negativity, because I think there's a tendency for all of us today as Catholics, and particularly as traditional Catholics, to be somewhat negative at times, not always, but to concentrate a lot on the negative aspect of being traditional Catholics and our duties as Catholics. And what I mean is that by that is that we kind of concentrate on what we need to stamp out, or what we need to correct, what we need to put a stop to. And very often we're inclined to concentrate on the sensational aspects of what's happening in the church today. So, what's the latest thing the Pope has done? What did we hear there on Rorate Cheli last week? Or whatever it is. And this tends to make us have a negative stress. So we try to expose error and correct wrong, and that's a good thing. And more than ever, actually, it's necessary. It's not that I'm saying it's not a good thing. It is necessary, and it looks like, in fact, that's going to continue for quite a while. But what I think, the problem is, first of all, I think women, and we as women, are often inclined to be the first to expose these things, to say we don't take the path of least resistance. I think the men are more inclined to do that. So we kind of call out error from the beginning, ab initio if you like. And Catherine of Siena supports us in this, because she says, cry out with 100,000 tongues. I see that the world is rotten because of silence. So she's not telling us to be quiet. But I guess the danger is, and I think, dare I say, that women are more subject to this temptation than men, that sometimes our criticism becomes habitual. And when it loses its original purpose, which is the restoration of all things in Christ and the glory of God, and when it becomes more about ourselves and our neighbour, or maybe our own hang-ups, or just even about our being right, that's when we lose more than we gain. That's when we give way to carping and bitterness, or even unjustified anger. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we've lost our trust. We've lost our trust, of course. And this is an understandable reaction to all the bad news that we've seen over the years. But when we lose our trust, we can become ghettoised. We sort of become ghettoised in our small communities, and we don't reach out to the stranger, reach out and welcome the newcomer. And I think when that happens, we've lost the soul of what we're doing. We've lost the soul of the apostolate. And we'll never make new converts when we do this. So if our criticism, we have to constantly assess when we're speaking negatively, say, well, why am I saying this? Am I saying it just because I've started to gossip, or because, I've nothing better to say, or are we saying it genuinely to promote the faith? If our criticism is genuinely faith-based and genuinely to promote the faith, then it's fine. But if it's not constantly reassessed in the light of this God-centred goal, then it can become very self-centred, and then we become a bore to ourselves and to others. And once this happens, we can inadvertently destroy our mission. And it's a pity, because it's begun with great zeal. So our mission as Catholic women is to bring others to salvation. And there's no doubt that people are attracted by joy and they're repulsed by negativity and inflexibility. So when we focus on something that we can positively achieve, we tend to be more positive and more joyful. And the mystery of joy for the Catholic woman is that it exists in the midst of suffering. Every woman that has ever given birth is aware of this in the most profound way. And this is where the Catholic understanding of joy parts company with modern psychology. So the psychologist tells us to focus on self and getting to know ourselves, and the Catholic knows to focus on God, because it's only in God that we can truly come to know ourselves. And it is only in God that suffering becomes joy. So every time we say the Salve Regina, and because we often say it in Latin, sometimes I guess we don't advert to it, but we say, "To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears." So we're acknowledging that suffering. So those who acknowledge that this life is about suffering, they're not killjoys or Jansenists, or they're just joy-filled realists who understand well the example of Our Lady and the centrality of the cross in Christian life. More and more of us are encountering such difficulties and obstacles with passing on the faith in a world that seems to do everything to counteract our efforts. And I know so many can feel so alone. Hopelessness is a very, very real temptation. And giving up is a very real temptation too. And women are very often at the coalface of that battle. And so our joy has to be something real and deep, not just smiling and being exteriorly happy, although we can do that too, I hope. But our joy has to be something far more foundational. Now, C.S. Lewis tells us that joy is the serious business of heaven. And so if this is true, no matter what the difficulties, no one can steal our joy. So we talked about reclaiming at the beginning, and to reclaim this femininity, we acknowledge that something's lost, but that something can be found. And that if it can be found, we can also recover it in all its beauty and all its fullness. It's something very positive. And precisely because that joy it's reclaimed in the midst of tears, both of joy and of sorrow for many women. I'm not going to talk about dress or any of the externals that we often hear. Instead, I'd like to imbue everyone, if possible, with a real desire to keep going. Just to keep going no matter what, and to keep going in joy. So in a radio interview in 2008, Cardinal Caffarra quoted Sister Lucy of Fatima as saying, "The final battle between the Lord and the kingdom of Satan will be about marriage and family." And now we can see this battle played out right in front of us. Speaking of the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, requested by heaven at Fatima in 1917, and in more detail at Tui in 1929, our Lord communicated to Sister Lucy, "They will do it, but it will be late, and Russia will already have spread her errors throughout the world." The spread of the errors of Russia, as foretold by the Blessed Mother at Fatima, is directly related to the attack on the role of women in our time. And as such, it's to Our Lady that we have to primarily turn in our mission to restore what has been lost. So nearly 4 months ago, a furore developed across the Western world over a commencement speech given by Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker at Benedictine College, Kansas. What followed his speech gave a fascinating insight into the vital importance of feminist ideology to the postmodern project. The vitriol was actually frightening. So what exactly did he say? Well, he gave what could be best described as an unashamedly Catholic speech, encouraging the young graduates of Benedictine to fully embrace their Catholic vocation as they sat at the edge of the rest of their lives. He talked in his speech of the post-God world, which the graduates would now need to negotiate. He talked of the failings of the Catholic bishops and clergy and the proliferation of heterodox ideas in Catholic circles. He criticised President Biden's support of abortion. He criticised birth control and the cultural emasculation of men. In other words, he openly said many things which were controversial and even would be considered extreme in today's world. And yet, and this is what is so telling, it was his words on women which caused the large majority of the furore. A few words, and they were mostly loving words, centred on his wife, were enough to cause a barrage of hatred across social media. So for those of you who didn't hear his talk, I'm sure there are a few, I'll read the few relevant paragraphs from the transcript, just so you know what I'm talking about. So he said, "For the ladies present today, congratulations on an amazing accomplishment. You should be proud of all that you have achieved at this point in your young lives. I want to speak directly to you briefly because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now about to cross this stage and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world. I can tell you that my beautiful wife Isabel would be the first to say that her life truly started when she began living her vocation as a wife and as a mother. I'm on the stage today and able to be the man I am because I have a wife who leans into her vocation. I'm beyond blessed with the many talents God has given me, but it cannot be overstated that all of my success is made possible because a girl I met in band class back in middle school would convert to the faith, become my wife, and embrace one of the most important titles of all, homemaker." And here the transcript records applause lasting 18 seconds, which is the interesting part. So here you can see that most of his words were actually really gentle words, and we see the reaction of the listeners, and it was all really positive. Plenty of applause. I think the key point, however, of his speech wasn't gentle. The key point was, I think it's you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. And these are true words. They're not mild ones, but they're true. And the problem is that it's truth that modernism fights and postmodernism fights most of all. Because there has been a war for a long number of years in society on this concept of objective truth. And the war has been fought primarily through our educational institutions and also, of course, through the media with the collusion of many church leaders. But I think it has been our educational institutions which really, particularly in Ireland, has had the most effect. Many Catholics now are unaware of the false philosophy that underlies their reasoning. You'll find very often today that it's very, very hard to have a debate with somebody because they focus on, are you hurting someone's feelings? But they're not actually interested in the truth of what you're saying. So the proclamation of objective truth without compromise is a scandal to contemporaries. And truth is very often replaced with this misguided regard for feelings and sensitivities. So these lies actually have even filtered into conservative Catholic circles. You'll find this emphasis on experience over truth and over fact. And actually there are a proliferation, which I'm sure you've come across online, of courses in Thomistic philosophy, which, to be honest, are an effort to kind of counteract this trend because it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. As far back, I won't say how far back, but certainly as far back as my own convent school days, and it wasn't yesterday, there was this whole emphasis on opinion opinion of fact, that's her opinion. So it's fine. It's Catholic. It doesn't matter that it's Catholic. It's her opinion, so leave her alone. So it doesn't matter. So truth and lies, everything on the same level. And the thing is, you had to do this. This had to be in place before what we have now, because once objective truth is removed as the foundation in society, then every lie is possible. Anything is possible. And you see that today now. We have, what is a woman? But that's only been made possible because truth has been, it's all about sensitivities, So this foundation this didn't happen today. This is the basis of the diabolical disorientation of which Sister Lucy of Fatima warned, and now we can see it all around us. It's everywhere. So in this case, with Harrison Butker, he was calling out the specific lies that have been told to women for a very, very long time. He did this by underlining that the title of homemaker is one of the most important titles of all. So I've some personal experience in this, because when my eldest son was born, I had no intention of staying home and looking after him. And it wasn't because I didn't have anything against being a homemaker or a stay-at-home mom or whatever you want to call it, but it just hadn't even entered my head. I just presumed I was on maternity leave. I'd been to college, I'd done all my degrees or whatever, and you go back to work when the few months are over, and that's it. And it wasn't until I looked at him and I looked at my baby and I thought, how am I going to do this? How? I remember at 10 months lying beside him, and I had taken everything. I'd taken my paid leave, I'd taken my unpaid leave. And I thought, I'm sunk. What am I going to do? I can't leave this baby. And we had no plan B. You need 2 salaries to get a mortgage. And I cried, and night after night I cried. And I had to go back for a couple of months, but that was it. I made a plan B, and I made it fairly quickly. And the thing is, I was angry. I was angry that after the sadness passed, I said, again, it was the lies. Nobody had told me this. It was supposed to be easy. You're supposed to leave your baby in a creche. The creche was booked. The school, at the time we lived in Dublin, and it was, so what school is he going to? Is he booked in? You're pregnant, and they want to know what school the child is going to. And I hadn't really thought outside the box. I was like, what? I'm supposed to know what school he's going to? I'm supposed to know his whole life before he's even born. So, it's very, very difficult. But I felt if I had known, I'd have made a plan. I would have thought, now, all's well that ends well, thank God. But the anger is funny, because when I was reading Pius XII, he said, woman alone can give true expression to the lament of a mother's heart when she sees a totalitarian state, says call it by what name you will, but I think that's what we have, trying to rob her of the right to educate her children. And here was Harrison Butker telling the truth, telling them when they needed to know, telling them at the start of their lives. And strange, isn't it, that a truth that affirms and is going to help so many women can be held to be anti-woman. That's the lie. I think, like women I know, women I went to college with, wanted to make this choice and they couldn't. They didn't have the economic support. So we see that all these things were brought to light during the last referendum, which was great. And I think we see that, not everybody has been taken in by the lies. We wouldn't have got the result that we got in the last referendum were that the case. People still value the role of a mother. They do. And I think I could dare to say, especially in Ireland, I think we have so much history that we value our mothers. As Chesterton, I think it's a well-known quote from Chesterton, but I have to quote it because I love it so much. He says, how can it be a large career to tell other people's children about the rule of 3 and a small career to tell one's own children about the universe? And how can it be broad to be the same thing to everyone and narrow to be everything to someone? No, a woman's function is laborious because it is gigantic. not because it is minute. I will pity Mrs. Jones for the hugeness of her task. I will never pity her for its smallness. So all Harrison Butker was doing really was reiterating what more and more people and women are coming to realise, that the role of the woman and the mother as homemaker is hugely important. And most interestingly, despite the length and breadth of the controversial topics covered, his supportive words to women were the ones, as I said, that sparked the most anger and disdain. But this shows the vital importance of the woman to the restoration of society. They wouldn't be bothered with this attack if the woman wasn't so vital. So I'll give you just a small taster of the criticism that went across the whole of social media. So as a woman, does watching Harrison Butker get cooked online count as being in the kitchen? Read one post on X. And from his Instagram account, I feel bad for those poor women who looked forward to their graduation and had you inflicted on them. BBC headline, Harrison Butker homemaker speech sparks backlash. So you can see how it's the homemaker all the time that they're focusing on. What it all proves, as I said, is that the truth and importance and the glory of the woman must be obscured in order, going back to what Cardinal Kafara said, for the kingdom of Satan to be victorious in this world. Genesis says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed, and she shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel. We know that God has ordained that victory over Satan will be through one woman, and that's Our Lady, through the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. And in all our efforts as Catholic women to fulfil this God-given role, we have to look to her as our principal model and protectress. So now I'm going to talk, we know what the problem is, and I'm going to talk about some false solutions, because I do believe that there are some false solutions around today, and there's a renewed and praiseworthy interest in the West, but I have to say in the US in particular, in reclaiming and fostering traditional values. And it's good because it's a reaction to the global and societal chaos that none of us can deny. But what tends to happen when people look for a solution is that they tend to go, okay, what's the simplest way to sort this out? And the simplest way that they see is that they'll go back. Let's go back to when men were men and women were women. And I'm not talking about gender ideology at all now here, but I'm just talking about let's go back. Let's see. Everything was okay in the 1950s, wasn't it? Can we sort it out? Can we go back to that? And of course, that can't work. The most obvious manifestation of this type of solution is the whole movement that we call trad wife. So trad wives, those of you who go online will know that they embrace traditional values. They're homemakers. They have large families. And but the problem is that the lifestyle they portray is far from real. So very often the income from their online activity is considerable, and therefore they're not really, they have this perfection of appearance that's really provided by their income, and that can leave other women feeling very underconfident. And the thing is, it's fine to have this reignition of interest in all things traditionally feminine, but I think what they're trying to here is to actually resurrect something that never existed. There was no such thing as this type of woman. There's a myth. Like you can't learn tradition from a book or a screen, and you can't model yourself on some type of ghost. We have to be women in our context and in our era. Like we're here for a reason, and we're fulfilling a particular mission in our time. Nobody is ever born in their time by accident. We're supposed to be here, and we're here because we have a mission in this time and in this context. So each woman's mission within this can vary hugely. So you think of St. Joan of Arc, for example. inner suit of armour. And it's true that none of us, or very few of us, or probably none of us, are going to have a mission of such magnitude. But the thing is, if this had been antithetical to femininity in any way, God could not have allowed it. He couldn't have demanded that from Joan of Arc had it not been feminine and had it not been true to her nature. So that shows the very, I think this is what I want to talk about next, that there's a very real danger. And I don't think it has hit Ireland as much as it has other parts of the world, but where femininity is simply reduced to baking cookies and long dresses. That's not femininity, If you think it is, you better change your mind pretty quick. This is a two-dimensional approach to femininity. And it is understandable. I'm not here to criticise anybody in that way, because I do get where all these mistakes are coming from. Like, very often these women who think this femininity, and to be honest, I think men are more behind this image. Again, resurrecting femininity from a book or from a screen. These men and women who feel like this, they've been educated for years in a system where where femininity, real femininity, has been routinely attacked or destroyed. So they're trying to reclaim what has been stolen from them, but they're trying to reclaim it in a vacuum. And very often they have no model apart from what they see from an era long gone. So they're trying to copy and paste, to use a kind of a digital model. They're copying and pasting, but they're not sure if they're original. They're not sure if they're OG. They're posting an AI generation. Okay, so this revival, it's very well meant, but it does more harm than good. And the mistake, what we're inclined to do is, and I've seen this happen, we divide girls and boys and men and women in our minds, and we say, girls like making pretty things, don't they? They like crafts, they like sewing. And boys, yes, we better get them doing something more aggressive, we better get them into the rugby and the football. And what we're doing here, we're confusing personality type with restoring femininity. So Jordan Peterson has done it, and he's still on his own journey. I know he's not Catholic, but he does have a lot of good things to say. And I'm not giving a sort of imprimatur to everything he says, so, just in case someone comes afterwards and says, oh, Jordan Peterson saying such and such. But generally, he has a lot of good things to say. And you'll find, what he says is that you'll find men and women overlap in the areas where they're alike and supposedly different, much more than you might imagine. So what you find sometimes is you have men playing up this sort of image of woman as a mysterious creature that can't possibly understand women, can't possibly understand them. And this is so much nonsense, it's nothing to do with authentic Catholic womanhood. What we're doing is we're confusing psychology with Catholicism. And it's not even good psychology, to be honest, because when we make these assumptions about personality traits, we're maybe right about 40% of the time, or maybe another time we're right about 60% of the time. But the greatest danger is that where we're wrong, that we're putting people off. And that's not what we want to do. So I have a bit of experience in this, because friends who know me well have heard this story a few times before, so apologies if you're hearing it again. But when I was a small girl of about 7 or 8, I didn't like dolls. I had no interest in traditional girls' toys, or I liked mechano sets particularly, which some of you might remember, and robots and train sets and all that. Not what was normally considered nice for girls. And one Christmas anyway, I asked for a train set. And it duly arrived. And when it arrived, this train set was accompanied by a little blue scissors. That's just a little extra. And I was delighted. But somewhere along the way, I got this vibe. I'm pretty good at picking up vibes, so I probably was when I was a kid as well. And I thought, people were having funny reactions when I told them I got this train set for Christmas. So I thought, yeah, this is probably something better kept under wraps, So after a while, after maybe 2 or 3 bad reactions, when people asked me what I got for Christmas, I decided I better say, I got a scissors. To my parents' eternal embarrassment, I told everybody I got a scissors for Christmas. But this is what, and these are the messages that we can sort of inadvertently pick up, as particularly if we're sensitive. So the thing is that the activities that we enjoy might not be related to femininity in any particular way. They may not. And like those of you who are Irish may not, or those who are not Irish, I should say, may not be aware that Irish men of the past were great knitters. They all knitted. They were fantastic knitters, sewers. My grandfather was the most masculine of men, as I know my mother would attest. He darned his own socks. He sewed. Nothing to do with femininity. Masculine men. So as Catholics and as traditional Catholics, we are at the moment, and it's a great thing, trying to restore an authentic Catholic culture, and we're trying to do this through the restoration of authentic Catholic masculinity and femininity. But if we focus, particularly with children, on personality traits, and if we focus too early and too strongly on these differences between the sexes, what we're in danger of doing is making these cardboard cutout men and women. And even more dangerous, we're actually, we're in danger of alienating those who don't fit into the model. This model, and the problem is this model has nothing whatsoever to do with Catholicism and everything to do with an incorrect understanding of psychology. So we're not going to do it with a souped up version of trad wife. That's not going to cut the mustard. So the question is, what is? If we're going to reclaim our femininity, what is going to cut the mustard? So we need a truly Christian and Catholic model of womanhood that's neither twee nor feminist inspired. Because we too can misunderstand completely what feminism means. Or we can reduce it to a joke and a nonsense and make it into something about doing the laundry or the washing up. And the thing is, when you make a joke of it, you do blind people to its real ideological dangers. In fighting feminism particularly, we need to reject this two-dimensional portrayal of womanhood, because they need that to exist. They need that to exist to justify their own raison d'etre. So if that isn't there, they've nothing to fight. And we particularly, the interesting thing is that as Catholic women, and particularly as Irish Catholic women, we have so many who preceded us, who can inform and inspire. We have generations of strong, faith-filled Catholic women who, they grasped in their own quiet and often not so quiet way that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And the thing is, they would never have bought into this false image of traditional womanhood that has invaded the New World particularly, because that springs intermittently from its Protestant roots. That's where its roots is, not Catholic. And we Catholic women have St. Bridget. She's a wonderful role model for Irish women today. And because our initial inspiration and starting point for the talk was this revisionist portrayal of St. Bridget as a feminist and a goddess. And even sometimes they even go so far as nearly portraying her as a patron of the occult. And there's a very deliberate attempt to confuse these two things, to confuse the Christian St. Bridget with the goddess. So I'm going to give you a few examples. Actually, it's interesting because this whole, the 1500th anniversary of St. Bridget allowed a lot of this messing around and this deliberate attempt at confusion. So I have a few egregious examples of that. The first is from Associated Press this January. They asked, who is St. Bridget and why is she inspiring many 1,500 years after her death? So while St. Patrick has long been the saint most identified with Ireland, they say, Bridget has gained a growing following in the 21st century. Devotees draw inspiration from Bridget the saint and from Bridget the ancient pagan goddess, whose name and attributes she shares. as emblematic of feminine spirituality and empowerment. This comes amid growing disenchantment with the patriarchal and historically dominant Catholic Church. From RTE, typical example, they said St. Bridget's values and passions are still being embraced, well, thank God for that, across Ireland 1,500 years after her death. A renowned peacemaker, she is also known as a protector of nature, putting a modern focus, indeed, on people's response to global conflicts and climate change. Wow. Although a religious figure, she's also associated with poetry, charity, nature, metal crafting and fertility. In recognition of her role as a protector of nature, this is the best, many see Bridget as the first real climate activist. So a real Greta Thunberg. Bridget has been branded, the thing is she's been branded a secular saint. And that, with all that entails. So ironically, as Father mentioned, the creation of a new bank holiday from 2023 in her honour, and this actually should be a very positive step for Catholicism, but it instead allowed for further deliberate confusion and appropriation of her legacy. In the January, when the new bank holiday was announced, the then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said, "From next year, Ireland will have an extra public holiday at the start of February to mark Imbolc / St. Bridget's Day. This will be the first Irish public holiday named after a woman." And I mean, immediately it makes it sound like some sort of overdue female victory. Like, I don't think we have any, apart from St. Patrick's Day, I don't think there's like scores of bank holidays named after men. But anyway, he said, or after anyone for that matter, it marks the halfway point between the winter solstice and the equinox, the beginning of spring and the Celtic New Year. So immediately he's mixing the pagan with Christian here. And then, it's funny, I was looking, Bridget 1500, this is the state-sponsored, if you like, programme of events. It's organised by Kildare County Council to mark this anniversary that we're marking here. In its own words, it says, St. Bridget the woman, the life and the legacy is commemorated in a broad, rich way. It was organised this year by Kildare County Council, and it includes really a mishmash of what it claims were the values she's championed, including biodiversity, sustainability, arts and culture, social justice. On the positive side, and this is good for any homeschooling mums out there, if you do look up bridget1500.ie, you will find some nice resources for children, as long as you choose carefully. Some nice pictures for colouring in and all that. From our point of view, St. Bridget, of course, is a Christian saint. And for us as Irish Catholic women in particular, she should be a very special patron. From her early biographies, we're given a portrait of a woman who is far from ordinary. She founded 2 monastic institutions, and Cogitosus, the writer of the earliest Latin life of Bridget, wrote between 620 and 680, and he gives us a fascinating and historically invaluable description of the church at Kildare, as it was in his day, rich and splendid for the time. It seems that before she died, she would have been mother at best to about 13,000 nuns. This is Father Sherry's area, so if I'm wrong there, you can correct me. But I think for our focus today, we're talking about St. Bridget the woman. What was she like? How can we use her as a role model? So, Alice Curtain's biography. She has a short and beautiful biography, which if you get a chance to read, it's actually available on archive. And it's very easy to read. But her description of her is, she stood isolated, without prototype, without peer. When she arose, it was as though with a decisive movement she pulled back a heavy curtain shrouding the scene. And at that gesture, all the other actors on the stage stand transfigured before a landscape where they see for the first time such freedom as they had never dreamed of and beyond. Vision, the world opened to them by the faith. Now, a priest from Cork, long deceased, a Father Marius McAuliffe, and on a side note, he wrote a very interesting biography of St. Pius X, which I think it's out of print, but there is every so often one pops up second hand on Amazon. He said once, the Irish don't pray to their own. And I can certainly give a very resounding mea culpa on that one. Like, I really, this conference has allowed me to get to know St. Bridget on a level I never had before. And now it seems the most natural thing to pray to her. And I hope that any of you are like me after this, and I'm sure there are plenty of you who are miles ahead of me, and I've been praying to her for the last years. But for those of you who are like me, I hope you get to know her as well as I do after this. Because as Father Sherry mentioned earlier, it was really the faith. The faith brought freedom here to Ireland. It certainly brought freedom to women in a most complex world that was pagan Ireland. In many ways, the Brehon laws, it seemed, would have given more freedom to women at that point in history than women would have necessarily had at other times in the world, in other places, I should say, at that time. But not for slave women. We had two types of women here. We had free women and we had slave women. So certainly not for slave women, and certainly not of the type of freedom that we see under Christianity. This whole new world, this fresh and unforeseen vision, was presented to Irish women by Bridget. And she was generous, so generous to a fault, as the saying goes, though the saying is inaccurate, as her biographers have looked for imprudence and found none. She was a peacemaker, and her warm humanity shone and illumined the coldness that was Druidical paganism. This very humanity and care for the simple but often overwhelming burdens of everyday life endeared Bridget to her contemporaries. And there can be no doubt that Bridget was loved and deserved to be loved by her peers. As Curtain notes in her biography, in Bridget's life we see none of the suffering of rejection or hatred that we see in the lives of other saints. We see other suffering, of course, but not of this type. We see, and in this early Irish Christianity, and again, I think one of our other speakers mentioned this, we see this unity. Oh, I know it was Sister, she talked about Christendom. We see the same, we see in early Irish Christianity this unity of purpose, this unity of heart. And it made for a strong bond between the nuns and the monks, between the lay person and the cleric. And even allowing for hagiographical embellishment of the time, because what you know when you read these early lies, it is a very different type of literature than what we're used to. But even allowing for that, you can't help but see, you see no evidence of the suspicion or distance or misunderstanding that sadly, later years we can see develops in ecclesiastical relations, or sometimes even now in relations between priest and people. There's none of this. St. Bridget was untiring in helping those who came to seek her aid. In this portrait of united hearts, we can see the prototype of the love that's needed now in our times, in a Catholicism really gone cold. And what I wanted to say actually is an interesting coincidence of dates. Today, the 31st of August, is the anniversary of the day the first feast of the Sacred Heart was celebrated with great solemnity in the Grand Seminary at Rennes. Leo XIII said, "There is in the Sacred Heart the symbol and express image of the infinite love of Jesus Christ, which moves us all to love in return. The love which breathes from the Gospel," said Pope Pius XII, "from the letters of the Apostles and the pages of the Apocalypse, all of which portray the love of the heart of Jesus Christ, expresses not only divine love, but also human sentiments of love. All who profess themselves Catholics accept this without compromise." So this very human love is what we see in the heart of St. Bridget also. And it's interesting that Ireland was second only to France in their devotedness to the Sacred Heart. It's also interesting to note that one of the criticisms of the devotion to the Sacred Heart, identified but roundly quashed by Pope Pius XII, was its appeal to women, and therefore its unsuitability for educated men. But of course the Pope decries this notion as a lot of nonsense. This devotion, he says, which we recommend to all, will be profitable to all. And he added that this counsel and encouragement with reference to the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, hence those forces of evil which have now for so long a time been taking root and which so fiercely compel us to seek help from him by whose strength alone they can be driven away. So women, and not without good reason, have been called the heart of the home. And therefore in our mission as women we can unite ourselves most closely to the Sacred Heart of Jesus in union with the Immaculate Heart of Mary, both the best remedies for the contemporary attack on true femininity. So going back to Bridget, because after all the conference is called In the Footsteps of Bridget, so we need to get to know her a little bit. I feel that she must be an Irish saint who watches over Irish women with so much solicitude. And she was noted particularly for her brevity of speech, which a trait maybe unfairly is considered pretty rare in women. But we won't argue on that, you can decide yourselves. So this is the story. A great light is thrown on her ways in that dialogue with Ailill. Now, please, if anybody is an expert in Shan Gaeilge or anything similar, excuse my pronunciation because I'm sure it's dreadful. But Ailill was son of Dunlain and King of Leinster. The story goes that Bridget had gone to Ailill at her father's request to obtain from the king permission for Dovthok to keep a certain sword which he kept on loan. The persons in his household likely to be most interested in Bridget's presence were the slaves, for the abbess's compassion on their lot was common knowledge. As you know, her mother was a slave woman. So while she waited for the master, one of the slaves, a man, saw his opportunity to approach Bridget. He implored her to procure his freedom, probably revealing to her all his pitiful experience. Bridget promised. She then had two requests to make of Ailill, to her father's now and the slaves. So when at last the warrior saw her, he was disposed to bargain. And he said, well, why should I give you all that? What have you to offer me? So although we know that Dunlain was a Christian, it does not appear that his son, Ailill, who Bridget was talking with, had been at this period baptised. Anyway, she promised him that her friendship would secure for him the following: excellent children, kingship for his sons, and ultimately the kingdom of heaven for himself. But Ailill seemed little attracted by those promises. And you actually can't help liking his reply, because what he said is, the kingdom of heaven, as I see it not, and as no one knows what thing it is, I ask it not. Kingship for my sons, moreover, I ask not, as I am still alive, and let each one serve his time. But give me rather length of life in my realm and victory over the O'Neill in battle. So you'd imagine at this stage now that this would be time for Bridget to sort of start a sermon, start talking about the truths of eternal life, or, rebut all his pagan philosophy, because his answer was quite cynical, although likeable. But prudence forbade Bridget antagonising him in any way, because she had souls at stake. So her brevity of speech and her wisdom shone out in her answer. What she said was, it shall be given. So perfect, beautiful answer. So there's another story that really, really shows her flexibility and her common sense, and I like it a lot. Again, it's in Alice Curtain's book, if you get to have a look. One day during Lent, the previous harvest having failed, the community found itself on the brink of starvation. Being forced to make some provision, Bridget had to travel with two of the sisters to visit a neighbouring monastery, then in the charge of Ibar. And she needed to beg from him the loan of a supply of corn. Now, the distance between the two churches was great, and the nuns arrived exhausted and famished at the monastery. And the other important thing was that famine was prevalent in the district at the time, so the only meal that was available was bread and bacon. And so the monks set bread and bacon before Bridget and the other two nuns, and Bridget, thankfully sort of began to lay in. And after a while, she noticed that her nun companions were, not partaking. So they were what I call pointedly refraining from the bacon. So the thing is, there was a sort of a sniff in their attitude. It wasn't that they were worried, but they had this sniff in their attitude saying, well, we're going to keep Lent anyhow, whatever you do. So not to avail, there obviously had been a dispensation accorded under circumstances of such stress. I think we were talking about that over lunch, Father Sherry, and about travel and dispensation and all that. But dispensations are often accorded under these circumstances, and the fact that the nuns were just not availing of it was more than Bridget could stand. So she rebuked them sharply and with vehemence, and she even went so far as to turn them out of the room. So it's funny because in all the stories, it's interesting because in all the legendary stories and traditions of Bridget, this is the only instance that's recorded where she actually displayed anger. And so what provoked it is worth remembering. This was somebody who's been pharisaical, but it was actually, they were masquerading as pious. So she was a wonderful woman, really, I have to say. Her very desire for peace seemed to heal strife and bitterness, and her heart was always moved by the real and relatable burdens of everyday life. And her interest was not only in religious vocations. And this was something, I think a trap that we can fall into in our time, particularly with fewer religious vocations. And I know people say, we have plenty of religious vocations in the traditional orders. Well, there are more than there are in other areas, but we know, and I remember this from last year's conference, that there are a lot of problems today with a lot of our modern context is proving a new challenge for vocations. I remember Father Abbe's talk last year where he talked about that. And sometimes I think one of the dangers is that we can focus, when we're so concerned about religious vocations, which we ought to be, that we can sort of focus on them for the top down, if you like. But, and the sister talked about this, religious vocations ought to come from the heart. It's like, if a child is taught to love God, then a religious vocation is something that may necessarily follow as a generous response to that. And it's a one generous response, of course, because there are others, but a very important one, because the sister said the world can't really turn without religious vocations. That is, but it comes from the generous overflowing of the heart with the love of God. So when Bridget met those even fixed in their choice of secular life, they flocked to Bridget. All girls, she welcomed all, not just aspirants to convent life. Her cheerfulness, her cheerfulness was a powerful magnet. She was always hospitable. She came from her sheep to welcome him. That's a beautiful image. And that's how the Laura Brack, or the Speckled Book, which is a medieval Irish manuscript, that's how it describes the meeting of St. Brendan and St. Bridget. And here she is again as the model of the feminine, the model in the homestead. So many of the stories of the lives of Bridget have reference to the land and to the pastoral. She obtains the milk of 3 good cows from one. She manages a miraculous plenty of butter in the dairy, having already given away much of it to the poor. And she tames ducks and foxes and even a wild boar. And she turns water into beer. But she's also the patroness of learning. And the two are not opposed, but they go hand in hand. One of the problems that after industrialization is that it falsely caused many to imagine a divorce between learning and manual work. But with Bridget, they're re-established as natural bedfellows. She fostered learning and culture, but she's equally associated with farm work. And Alice Curtain has some lovely words in her. She calls her an intellectual dairymaid, a cowherd with culture, a field labourer promoting art and literature, and a shepherdess with learning. So I figured a perfect model for us homeschooling mothers. Thing is, so much has been made of her commitment to peacemaking, and that is certainly something we can emulate. And I mentioned earlier as well the central role of Our Lady and the Immaculate Heart in the final battle, which focused so heavily on the woman. It has to focus very heavily on the woman in order to destroy the family. And we're now at the time when this battle has reached such a climax that we're actually not sure where to go, I think, a lot of the time. Fatima has been called heaven's key to peace, and as such, the requests of Our Lady of Fatima should form a large part of our apostolic focus. Am I okay for time, Liam? No? Okay. I actually thought I had too little here, so I'll speed up. So in the internship of spring 2023, we focused on another interesting lady. I promise this is my last. She's not Irish this time, but she'd all the same characteristics as the much loved St. Bridget. But it's important because she shows us another dimension, because we've heard a lot on religious vocations today, and I just wanted to talk about a woman in the world. So big shout out today to Nadine O'Donoghue from our Kilkenny Chapel, who wrote this for me. So at the tender age of 11, Frances wanted to abandon the world. This is Frances of Rome, by the way. I might have said this in my zeal to finish. She wanted to abandon the world to love God with an undivided heart in the solitude of the cloister, but God had another plan. Resigned to God's will and her father's wishes, she married a wealthy young aristocrat, Lorenzo Ponciano. Early in their marriage, it was clear to Lorenzo that his wife had special gifts, and so he trusted her with the care of his whole estate. She proves assiduous in the superintendence of household affairs and in her attention to the good of her children, her family, her servants, taking great care of their souls as well as their temporal needs. In the mornings and evenings, she attended local churches for devotions and Holy Communions. Sadly, another blessing many of us don't have today. Determinedly, she spent every spare hour in prayer at her oratory. She read spiritual books. She conversed on religious topics. Frances loved to practice almsgiving, especially helping the most unfortunate, and she put her hand to the plough in earnest. When famine and plague had reached their worst, she gave away all her provisions and set up a hospital in her home. And when her heroic works of charity emptied the family granary and cellar, they were miraculously replenished with an abundance of corn and wine. By her example, she inspired the noble class of Rome to increase their liberality and encourage them to serve more abundantly the suffering members of Christ. But Frances sought to, I'm going to skip a bit. Frances sought to persuade other noble ladies to shun the world of pomp and softness. Many renounced a life of idleness, followed in her footsteps, imitated her virtues, pious exercises and daily works of charity. For these Roman matrons, Frances founded a house of oblates under the rule of St. Benedict. They had a special apostolate to the sick and the poor. They aspired to be the hands and feet of Christ for the suffering people of Rome. After the death of her husband, she begged admission to the cloistered life. Her wish was granted, and although she was spiritual mother and superior to the whole community, she gloried in calling herself everyone's servant. She died in 1440 and was canonised by Pope Paul V in 1608. So this is important. As a Catholic wife and mother, she reached out to the wider world. While married, she dedicated herself to corporate and spiritual works of charity, established 2 oratories, set up a hospital in her home, composed a rule of life, and founded a religious order. This is what I wanted. One of the errors of Russia and Marxism, of which Our Lady of Fatima warned, was that one we don't even recognise often as modern women. The tax system squeeze on the middle classes mean home help is often not a financial option. The break-up of the family unit and the introduction of state-sponsored childcare without anything close to equal help for those who choose to stay at home and be the childcare, taken together mean mothers who work in the home can be quite isolated without any support from friends or relatives. And the Industrial Revolution has separated man and wife, so that in a majority of houses, the wife is at home taking care of the children on her own. So the net result is often a family where the wife who stays home has very little or no time left for activities outside the home. This can be a huge obstacle to this mission of reclaiming femininity, and it might be one of the reasons why the younger generation isn't that excited by the idea of setting up a traditional home. So marriage shouldn't be a prison sentence. It should be a joy-filled vocation where we're free to flourish while we're fulfilling our duty of state. And for those of us not involved in the political scene, the only remedy I have for this for now is to pray for the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. But if you feel overwhelmed as a mother, you need to know that your problem is a real one. It's not one you're imagining, because it's caused by the errors of Russia. So as a Catholic mother and wife, Frances was a pillar of her family home, but she was also a beacon of community life. She was a saintly role model for her family, the rich, the poor, and all in her city. But she was also an incredible example of good work, strong faith. And really women, true femininity is often about women being at the coalface of action when it's required. Pius XII, speaking in 1945 on women's duties in social and political life, I think this is something we've forgotten, he said the following: every woman, without exception, is under an obligation, a strict obligation of conscience, mind you, not to remain aloof. Every woman must go into action, each in her own way, and join in stemming the tides which threaten to engulf the home, in fighting the doctrines which undermine its foundations, in preparing, organising, and completing its restoration. So, when I was thinking of how to finish and how to bring together this portrait of femininity that's strong and noble and should be centred on Our Lady, at whose feet all our efforts should be placed, I could only think of one line of scripture. And anyone who has ever been in the Legion of Mary will know that this antiphon from the Song of Solomon is recited at every meeting. Who is she that cometh forth as the morning rising? Fair as the moon, bright as the sun, terrible as an army set in battle array. And I think if we can make that portrait our own, there are no more words. The dream of the woman.